This is Kelly.
And this is Amy.
And you're listening to Diary of a Death Investigator. So this is our second time trying to record this episode. Our spooky episode of the season, which we're calling Not Another Chainsaw Movie, Part 1. In Part 2, you're going to hear us say that we have our fingers crossed that Part 1 actually worked out as far as the audio, and it didn't.
Obviously, it did not.
So a week later, we are now re-recording it, which is a bummer because it was really good.
Yeah, I don't think the second time's always as good as the first, but I'll do my best.
Also, I think the shock factor wears off a little bit because you were saying things that I was like, oh.
Well, maybe you've forgotten some of it and you'll just be surprised again.
True story. Also, Amy and I did realize, and you guys were probably screaming when you listened to our last episode, we didn't know that the Chainsaw Massacre and Leatherface and everybody was Ed Gein. So now we know they're the same person.
Well, based upon. Yeah. So that's basically what our second one is about, because we know that that Leatherface is based on two different true crime figures that are pretty prominent. So Ed's going to make his appearance in our second part.
I had no idea who Leatherface was. I didn't even know.
Well, you don't watch those movies. So if you don't, there's some real diehard people that are into horror films, and, this is like their favorite time of the year. They thrive in this time. So if you drive around my neighborhood, you can actually see all the Halloween people. And there's one house I really don't like driving past because it's all clowns. I'm like, who likes clowns, let alone creepy clowns? So
that's funny.
Yeah, I think gory films are different than scary because it's not necessarily scary. It's just kind of ew. So
yeah, I'm more into thrillers. I think we're playing, you haven't played yet, but Fort Nightmares.
Yeah.
On Fortnite. And this season, well, okay, let me back up. I said this when we were recording the episode last week that Leatherface reminds me of that car that you had never seen on the road before. And then all of a sudden you start talking about it with somebody because you're interested in buying it. Right. And then you see it everywhere. So now I'm seeing him everywhere, and he's in Fortnite right now, along with the Jigsaw Saw Clown.
Yeah. And that's funny that you say that because, now I've seen it all over my Instagram all the time. And I'm I'm tired of him. I feel like he haunts me in my dreams and when I'm alive. It's like Nightmare on Elm Street. He's crawling out of my nightmares to haunt me.
And mostly because you're having to re-record this.
Well, I think especially during this time of year, you just see it what it is. So, or it's the creepy cars. There's me and Garrett have actually seen in our neighborhood, there's this ice cream van, and it's a really creepy ice cream van. And it's actually funny because it was going around right before we started recording, and they play the music so loud. And I have never seen a kid actually come out and buy ice cream from this van. And me and Garrett both said how creepy this looked because it's beat up, there's no windows, and it's dragging these straps out of the back of it, and we're surely this is not just ice cream. Either it's a front for drugs or he's a creep. So
you should put your medical examiner shirt on and go out there and try to buy ice cream from him and see what he does.
Right. So so what do you got in your freezer, sir?
Well, maybe it's a she, maybe it's a her.
You know what? People can be whatever they want to be now. So maybe it's a she, her, him, whatever. So I don't know. Maybe I just shouldn't give any names to them. So.
Oh, I'm just saying that if you can't see the tinted windows, you're not really sure who's in there.
There are no windows.
Oh, so you can see a person in there.
It's the front windows, right? But then the back, it's completely covered. It's one of those creepy white vans.
Oh.
And it's... What is the song that do? It's so creepy. I can hear it from blocks away.
Ah, well, I'm sure it's innocent.
Until it's not.
All right. So part one of our episode is going to be about a gentleman that they call the Candyman. I thought it was actually based on the Candyman movie, and then I read about the Candyman movie, and it's not the same at all.
I've never even seen that or heard of that. So,
well, when you work at Blockbuster,
yeah, that's fair.
You got exposed to a lot of things.
Life-size cutout figures. So, all right. Well, let's start with this here. So, I guess we talked about this a long time ago. I kept saying how I wanted to do or cover the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies because I knew that it was based upon a character that is a real life person. And as you do more research, like Kelly said, you kind of figure out who these people are. So it's actually based upon two different people. Now, over the span of time, this whole movie franchise, there's been 9 movies put out about this. So, of course, they have like the prequels and the sequels and all these things. So the first movie was put out in 1974. And that's kind of when all this stuff was big in the news. Then we have
serial killer era.
Yeah, and it totally was. And actually, as we talk more about this, we'll see that's when bodies were being found during this time. So 1974 was like there were arrests being made. It's kind of like hot on the press. It's like, get it while it's good. So I think people had just heard a lot about this and they thought that would be a great way to capitalize on it. So we have the first one that's in 1974. So it's going to be the original like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then they made one in 86 and in 90, 94, and then 2003, 2006, 2013, 17, and 22. And I didn't even know they made one in 2022. I obviously did not watch it. So basically the premise of this movie is there's a group of friends that are traveling to their grandfather's grave in Texas. I think 2 of them are friends and 2 of them are actually brother and sister. So there's like 4 of them total. And these groups of friends, they said that there were reports of vandalism and grave robbing, which we find out with Ed Gein, that was one of his favorite things to do was to rob graves. So
what a hobby.
Yeah, no kidding. The more I thought about it, I was like, dang, that would actually be like a really good workout because digging's hard. That's not an easy thing to do. So
yeah, and then digging and splicing, and he had to do it all like that night because people would be there the next day.
Yeah, I mean, he must have had really great cardio fitness. So you never know. Maybe he had to make a run for it after. We do not know.
His bag of goods.
I mean, he could have stuffed them in his clothes. It seems like he liked to wear them. So you don't know.
Yeah.
So the more of this movie that goes on, which is where we get introduced to our Leatherface character. These group of friends, they stop at their family's old farmhouse and they discover the family next door are cannibals. And this is the Sawyer clan, and Leatherface is a part of this cannibal Sawyer clan. So like I said, this is based upon 2 different characters or people. We call them characters. Ed Gein, which is going to be introduced in our second episode. And I think that was in Wisconsin where he was committing those, or he committed murders and then was doing all this other stuff. But the guy that we're talking about today, his name is Elmer Wayne Henley. And this was based out of Houston. So the guy that actually played Leatherface in the movie, his last name is Hansen, Gunnar Hansen, I believe. He prepped for this role as Leatherface by spending time with, this is their quote, mentally handicapped people to basically study their mannerisms, especially when they would get upset. So he wanted to kind of mimic that in the movie because that's what the character is based on. So obviously, Leatherface, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? So Leatherface wore a small leather mask to cover up his deformities and worked at a slaughterhouse where apparently he had been born. Like any origin story begins at a slaughterhouse. And then it said he had a tendency toward self-mutilation, and he had been diagnosed with the type of neurodegeneration at 12 years old. Now, we don't know if this is like something that Ed Gein or our Candyman was diagnosed with, but this is just based upon what we know in the movie. So getting more into our facts here. So Elmer Wayne Henley, like you said, he was named the Candyman, or they also called him the Pied Piper. And this is because his family had previously owned and operated a candy factory in Houston Heights.
Like Willy Wonka.
Yeah, seriously. And Willy Wonka is more creepy than I don't get why people like that movie, because who likes the Oompa Loompas? I don't know. It's not like they're like the Minions. They're not cute like the Minions and Gru, like Despicable Me. It's not the same thing. Ask Garrett. They give you nightmares. He doesn't listen to this, so we can make fun of him.
That's true. That's true.
If he listened, we wouldn't spoil these things. So we know that our Candyman is actually responsible. Well, as is stated today, 28 deaths of teenagers, young boys. I believe that their ages range between 13 and 21 years old. Now, that's kind of a bit of a speculation because I don't think all these boys were necessarily people that were cared about. I think there were a lot of people that were kind of lived on the street and were having kind of a hard time. The more you read about it, it's very sad, actually. He did horrible things to people. We know that he had abducted and tortured, sexually assaulted, and then murdered these boys. Now, he had actually hired some guys to help him draw these boys in. So we have two different people here that are his associates. And so one of them, the last name of Brooks, he was kind of the first henchman of our Candyman here. And so he would actually go out and meet these guys and tell them, hey, I can provide you with weed. You just got to follow me back to this house. And then once he got him back to the house, that's when the Candyman got to do what he wanted at his house. And so I believe that it was at age of 17, Henley was brought in by Brooks. And so Henley and Brooks were kind of the henchmen of the Candyman here. So I think Henley was just 17 years old at the time. And he, like I said, was a part of bringing these boys in off the street.
And weren't they paid like a couple $100s or something? And back during the 70s, that was a lot of money. Like this guy had a lot of money.
Yeah, because they had owned that candy factory. So they think that part of that money was coming from a child sex ring that was based out of Dallas. And so... yeah, they think that they were getting the money basically per boy once they brought them in. So it was either they bought them out or they were basically the Candyman's victims. And I think that it was actually stated that it was like $200 per kid, which, yeah, like you said, that's a lot of money. That can go a long way. So, and I believe that Brooks was able to actually get Henley or draw Henley in with that money because I don't think that he actually had like a very stable life. So he was definitely brought in by the money. I don't think he actually did any of the like torturing or anything himself. And I think that was kind of the demise of our Candyman later on, was because of that. There are several bodies that were found. Specifically, one place that they did mention, they had rented out this boathouse in Houston where they show, there are actually pictures online of 7 bodies that were found that were buried in this boathouse. Now, I think that I've told you before, especially in Houston, you can get very bad storms there. They can be affected by hurricanes, tornadoes, and it's extremely humid. So if you're thinking about bodies being in that kind of environment, not only probably being affected by the humidity for sure, but also being basically submerged underwater at different times during all these years, it will definitely degrade a body, but it'll definitely stink as well. So,
wait, I have a question. Mm-hmm. What is a boathouse? Like, is it on the water or is it close to the water or is it just like a storage space for boats?
Yeah, typically I think boathouses have always been like something that's on the water where you can actually drive the boat into it and then it's kind of like a dock. It's like an enclosed dock kind of thing. I think this one was a dirt floor. So it was like right next to that.
So the floor was probably wet.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what kind of the soil would be like there, which would actually affect how the bodies were preserved as well once they were buried. I know that in different areas of the Midwest, there's a lot of clay, and clay can lock in a lot of moisture as well. And it isn't necessarily kind to decomposing bodies either. So yeah, but if you're on the water too, there's a lot of weird smells that kind of come off the water.
Oh, that's true.
Dead fish. I think a lot of people usually when they catch fish or they gut them or whatever right there. So I think that's kind of a normal smell, or things that are just kind of died and deceased on the shoreline there. So I don't think that would necessarily raise a red flag if someone smelled something funky coming out of there. They did process the crime scene, which would be, or one of the many crime scenes. I think there was 3 of them total. This one was processed by the St. Augustine County Sheriff's Office. And you can actually see where they're shoveling bodies out, and they have this diagram where it's mapped out of these bodies. So they were able to find 7 of them, and they were basically stacked on top of each other, and they were wrapped in plastic. And something that's also interesting is that these weren't very deep graves either. So it makes me kind of think or believe that maybe they might have been in like a fetal position when they were dumped into the graves. I think the size was 36 inches deep. So that's like 3 feet, 24 inches wide, and 42 inches in length. So they had to have been
small.
Yeah, it is really small, especially if you're doubling up bodies, like one on top of each other. So yeah, they weren't very deep, which also allows for other critters, so any type of bugs or smaller animals, to basically dig down into that and have access to that as well. I know that they did find other things buried with them as well. So one of them was like a Venetian blind cord and a plastic covering. So basically something that was used for strangulation that they just decided to dump with the bodies. So like I said, that was one of the places. And it's kind of interesting to see the difference between the care that is put into recovering bodies that are buried from then to now. And a lot of that is just education on these things. So you can actually see pictures of them with shovels and a wheelbarrow digging into the graves and basically just shoveling these bodies into wheelbarrows. So now, obviously, we have anthropologists that will come out to a scene. It's like, even if people find a deer bone or something, typically a medical examiner or investigator goes out to that scene. Or I know there were occasions where we would have the officers send us a picture of the bones, and then we would forward those pictures on to our anthropologist so that he could kind of confirm or deny if it was something that we should be concerned about. A lot of times it was deer bones. So saved us a lot of time.
But better to be safe than sorry.
Yes, but I think it's pretty obvious when something looks like a chicken bone.
Well, yeah, but you just never know. Especially, I think you mentioned something that you saw on TikTok or about a woman who she saw bones and she found them in her backyard. Yeah,
they were digging a fence and like along the fence line, and she found a rug buried. And at first, I know that the police were like, not worried about it. And then I think they came back later and were like, maybe we should care about this, which actually, like, burying something along a fence line is actually pretty genius. I mean, now, I will preface that with saying the type of fence it is, because wooden fences have to be replaced all the time. But if you put a cinder block fence in, that thing's not going anywhere for a long time. And so typically, if a body's buried pretty deep, they bring in this machine. I will say, just imagine like a lawnmower with like an X-ray machine attached to it. It has handles on it, and you just push it over the surface. So basically what that does, it just sends these waves, these X-rays down to the ground. And then it's like ground penetrating, right? So whatever has some type of density under the ground, those waves are going to bounce off that and then come back up to the machine or to the surface. And so it's basically measuring the density of what that object is and how deep it is. And you can get a pretty good idea of what something is underground because it kind of maps it out with those waves. And if you have a fence that's covering that and you have cement over that too, the cement is going to provide some type of dense coverage as well. It's a little bit harder to penetrate through that. You're not going to get as clear of a visual after going over that. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could probably.
But I asked you, like, because she called the cops like as soon as she saw the rug, because she thought it was a body wrapped in a rug. So I asked, like, well, wouldn't she just dig it up? Because I mean, I would probably dig it up. And you're like, well, no, because that you could mess up the crime scene because of it. And I didn't think about that. So I guess maybe she's a true crime.
A lot of that has to do with the preservation of evidence because of like the carpet as well. So if you are really struggling to pull that carpet out or dig around that, you could actually cause tool marks into that carpet or into bones as you're trying to recover that or disturb basically the original position that they're in, which a lot of times investigators want to document as well because of basically the surrounding areas of that carpet. Think about what's going to be drawn out into that soil or what could be in that surrounding soil. So it's just better just to let a professional do it because anthropologists are very meticulous in how they do their job. I had to take a course on it one summer and it was really hard. I will say I would not define it as fun because it was really, really hot in the middle of summer. It was like 100 degrees and really humid. And we were having to dig through a really hard clay soil. And you're working in teams. And so someone may not agree with how you are processing the scene. And it's more than just that hole. It's like the surrounding area around that, because maybe there's other things that are buried near it. So you have to first figure out which would be an actual grave. And then once you determine that, it's like, okay, well, this is our surrounding area that we're going to start digging in. And you have to go layer by layer. And these layers are like maybe an inch, maybe a centimeter. It depends on how much is being found there. And they basically sift it through this grater. And then whatever is important, they'll set that aside. And then you have to actually put that dirt that you've sifted through into other buckets because you might have to go back through those later to see if you find other things of pertinent evidence in there.
So you mean they weren't just taking a shovel and putting it in a wheelbarrow like these guys were in the 70s?
No. I think you could miss a lot. And I think the major thing with using like shovels is the tool marks that could be added to those remains. Now, you can typically tell what's new and what's not new, but still thinking about that going into court, that's always something that could be brought up or questioned by a defense attorney. Like, well, how do you know this didn't occur after our client came into contact with them, because he's saying he didn't know about this location and he didn't use these type of tools. He didn't find these tools in his residence at the time. So maybe the tool marks on those bodies don't match maybe what they discovered from the home or the crime scenes. So I think that's really important, definitely, to keep in mind the difference between how it was then and now. So I know that there were other things that they found in their other quotes, crime scene locations. There was actually this cabin that they had. There were things found underneath this cabin, and it was like plastic gloves, shovels, sacks of lime.
And not the juice.
Not lime juice. So I think we talked about this the last time, was like lime is actually used to basically cover the smell.
I think it's like a bit of preserving the bodies, but I don't think that was their intent on doing it. I think the intent, because in our first one that you guys don't get to hear, Amy and I like looked it up because it was to mask, I think, the smell. Yeah.
Well, especially because they were using those plastic bags too. So I think that they were putting that into the plastic, especially if it is humid. So,
well, let me catch another rat. couple of rats underneath my house. I'll put them in a bag. I'll put them in with lime, and
you'll do a science experiment.
I'll let you know if it smells, because what you guys also missed in the last episode we recorded that you won't hear. I had a couple of rats that we caught like in what I call my scary room, and the smell was so bad. Like it was so bad. I couldn't figure out what it was, and it's nothing like I had ever smelled before. And so I can't imagine what like these bodies or these rooms smell like, especially like this boathouse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's going to smell worse when it's in an enclosed area inside a room than it would. I mean, hopefully at that point, for the person that's recovering this, they're decomposed enough where the smell isn't as bad. But ultimately, you would like to have some type of preservation for if you're the one that's prosecuting, right? So, I mean, maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing that they use lime.
Well, I kind of thought that maybe it would mummify the bodies a little bit too because of the humidity, like just the environment, no breakdown.
Basically, what happens with humidity is when it's very hot, it's going to bloat them up beyond recognition, and then it speeds up that decomposition rate as well. So, and especially being inside a plastic bag, you're just trapping in more heat. So, that just makes me like gag thinking about it, because I've been in contact with some very disgusting decomposing bodies in the middle of summer, and a body can maybe be outside in let's say like 100-degree weather, but it's amplified by the humidity. And so it could be like 60% humidity or greater, and it's going to speed up that rate of the decomposition, and the bacteria is going to like just go insane. So literally you can't tell who these people are because they bloat up so big. Sometimes bodies wouldn't even fit into the body bags because they were bloated so badly, like in their stomach. Like you just could not zip the bag. So yeah.
That's humidity.
Yeah. Now you're going to get mummification in those really dry desert locations. So refer back to our episode about mummifications.
Apparently I need to re-listen.
Yes, Kelly, but that's been a hot second since we've done that. I think that was one of the ones we did with Mamma Mia, actually. So, yeah. When they're looking for these bodies, I think that during this time, especially DNA wasn't a thing. So it was really hard for them to make identifications on these people. And all they had to go off was basically anybody who was a missing persons, or whoever I believe it was Henley, basically told them like, hey, I know for sure it's this guy that we buried there. So basically you're just taking anything that you know about someone that's been a missing person in that location, and then you're using those features, those bodily features, just to attempt to make your identification off of. Because even then, how often did people go to the dentist or the doctor and get x-rays done? I don't think that was such a common thing. I think, well, obviously healthcare has come a long way, and it's actually ended up helping with identification along with DNA. We know that there was an individual that they talked about in particular. He was unknown number 15, and his body was finally identified. I have the years between 2010 and 2011. And he was estimated to be between the age range of 20 to 21. And his estimated height is 70 to 72 and a half inches. So what they're doing when they have something like this, they have the diagram of the skeleton. And then in this diagram, they actually colored in what bones were present. A lot of times it's really hard to recover all the bones, especially when you have those little tiny metatarsals from your fingers or from the feet. So they put the skeleton back together, and then they get a rough estimation from that. And so what they could tell from our unknown number 15 was that he did have multiple rib fractures. And they're saying that this was on the right side of the rib cage. And they're saying that it was the ribs number 3, number 9, and number 10. And they later identified, or they found out from Henley, and they were able to kind of put that together with the type of fractures that they were. They said it was being hit with a sledgehammer.
Oh.
Yeah. And so, that also makes me think about maybe if he was still intact with his organs, I don't know if maybe we would see punctures in the lung or other organs beneath those. It depends on how bad those fractures are. And you can definitely tell what are healed fractures and what are new fractures, because typically healed fractures are going to have some type of calcification over them, or like a bony, like nodule type of thing, where it's not going to be that smooth surface. It's going to have, like I said, that calcification. And so a new fracture obviously is not going to be healed over. So what they ended up doing is they were able to identify our unknown number 15 between the years of 2010 and 2011 by DNA. So the prior analysis was done by physical. They said dental, but they actually did a misidentification. So could you just imagine having to go back later on and tell this family, like, sorry, this actually wasn't your son. We still don't know where he is, but this is someone else's child. So that would be a really difficult job to do. I would not want to do that, even though it wasn't like my mistake or the present pathologist's mistake. You can make a lot of families upset. And of course, this is a lot of time that's gone by. How many years? 40 years later. So maybe those family members aren't even alive at that point. And so I know a lot of times by making a positive identification, you bring a lot of closure to families. And so I feel like that would just kind of reopen a wound for some of these people. So unknown number 15, he was originally identified as Stephen Sickman. And so they said that, they actually identified him to Stephen Sickman, where he was before believed to be Mark Scott. So one thing that did help them actually with these identifications, which we've talked about before, what we call prosthetic appliances. And so it's not just things for people that are missing limbs, but it can also refer to things that people use, like dentures or like bridges in your teeth. So a long time ago, people used to like have retainers or something with like teeth attached. So if they were missing a tooth, that was just kind of an easy fix instead of doing like a bridge or like a screw into your maxillary and then put a prosthetic tooth over the top of that. That's a lot more common now than what it used to be. I think that's kind of a newer thing.
I think they did it more for like kids, because I remember we had a cousin who had one, and I think it was probably more for kids, like when it was closer to, I mean, it wasn't, well, I'm not trying to age us or anything, but I want to say like, 30 years ago, because your mouth's still growing, your teeth are still falling out. So you don't want to have to put anything permanent in there if you're still growing.
Right. You have wisdom teeth. And then if you have baby teeth still in, those can fall out. And a lot of, like you said, your teeth can move a lot within that time, especially if you do get more molars, that's going to shift your teeth quite a bit. One of the things that they said that they were able to actually use, I thought this was interesting, was an axilla prosthetic appliance, which is actually something that fits into like the shoulder, like socket. And so your arm, it's not attached by any other bones, right? It's attached to ligaments to your shoulder. And so kind of what this prosthetic appliance is, it's like a sling. And so it's like an arm that fits up into that socket, but it's held on by like a sling type of thing. So they were able to make identifications through that.
So they had a body part in there? Like a prosthetic that was in the grave?
That's what was stated. Yes. And I think, we talked about the last time you asked about like breast implants, because things have serial numbers. And so, yes, we actually have made an identification before from someone's breast implants. You can typically actually take that serial number and go back, not only look up who that is, but who actually put in that implant and when. I think implants have also changed in what they're actually made out of too. And so like a silicone, or I'm not quite sure what they like use now, but I know that there was a problem with you can tell kind of how old that is as well from what it's made out of and the hardness of it, because that's your body breaks things down, right? It's a foreign object in your body. So yeah, all those things have serial numbers on them. Also, like dentures do have names or like a serial number attached to that. And I know like hip joints, like those are like metal, they're steel. And so you can even have prosthetics in that kind of way where you can go back and kind of figure out at least where it was done at, and you have some type of way to track that. So kind of interesting looking at prosthetics or things that can help you other than dental, because if you have something with a serial number, you're like, yes, because that should tell you exactly who that person is, unless you had people that were other people's dentures, which I don't know who would do that. But hey, if you're hard up on needing some teeth and you find some on the street, and maybe you're a drug addict and you need some teeth,
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe you need them, because I remember actually getting into an argument one time with, it might have been our chief, because I was like, there's dentures here. This is the person based on these dentures. And they're like, well, how do you know it's their dentures? I'm like, don't they fit dentures to fit people's mouths? Like, I don't know. I mean, I've heard crazier, but I was like, they were still stuck in there. They weren't coming out.
I don't know much about dentures, but I figure they're probably a lot like retainers.
Yeah. Well, especially if someone has like an upper and a lower set, they're fit to that person's mouth. Like they take, those disgusting like forms that you're like, ugh, when all they're doing, your mouth's foaming. So it's kind of a unique to that person thing. I mean, I don't think it'd be very comfortable to wear someone else's dentures, but hey, I've never done it, so I don't know.
Yeah, don't knock until you try it.
Yeah, let's hope that I don't have to do that in the near future either. I don't plan on doing drugs anytime soon, or, getting in a bad accident. I would like to keep my teeth. That'd be fantastic. So I think Mom would like that too, because braces, I know, were not cheap. So there's a couple doctors that they have here that were kind of the well-known doctors that worked on this, or at least the ones that I could find online that worked these autopsies, or the new autopsies, basically. So re-identifying or properly identifying these people. And I know I struggled with this guy's name. He's an MD and a JD. So JD is your Juris Doctorate. So he's a doctor lawyer. His name is Joseph A. Jacquemzik. That's as good as it's going to get, guys. So I know that he was kind of a main pathologist that was working on identifying these people. There was a chemist and toxicologist back in 73. His name was James A. Zotter. So I saw his name on quite a bit of this stuff as well.
Why a chemist?
Well, basically a chemist who's a toxicologist, because you can't be a toxicologist without being a chemist or having some type of chemistry degree. A toxicologist, I think we've talked about this before. If there is any remaining organs or tissue there, they can actually blend that up and they can test that.
No.
Yeah. That was the worst, going in to the tox lab and you're like, what is that smell? And they're like, oh, it's a decomp liver. And I'm like, great. Like, love that for you guys. And it's like currently blending. You're just like, ugh, I don't know what's the worst smell. Like the smell of like the decomp when you originally get it out, or that freshly brewed cup of decomp liver. I don't know. That's a pretty unique smell. So toxicologists can also look at what is in the surrounding areas of the soil when that body's found. So if they found anything else, so I'm sure that probably looking at things that were covered in lime, he could probably identify the lime. I'm not sure if lime has different types of composition, maybe by the factory that made that lime. So you might be able to specify where that lime was created and possibly where it's sold at, because different manufacturers only go to certain locations. So that could have possibly been the reason why they had him working on this as well. So yeah, toxicologists do a lot more than what we think they do. So yeah. Beyond the lab. The toxicologists were some of my favorite people. I went in there and chatted up with them all the time. They're very intelligent people, and I learned a lot from them. Except for, like I said, I had to avoid the days where it was like decomp blender day. So
yeah, no body smoothies.
No, not the best smell, especially when you see that and it's like this mushy dark. I mean, your liver's dark already, but it's just like, it's green. And you're just like, ugh, that should not be that color.
I do have to tell you something. You know how you always have said that if you smell or if you're going into like one of these situations with dead bodies or whatever, don't put Vicks on your nose because it will like keep the smelling.
So sticks.
Yeah. So the other day the cat got sprayed with a skunk or got in a fight with a skunk. Yeah. When I tell you that it made me throw up twice, like it was so bad. It was, but I like went and took a shower and like it was in my nose. It was just stuck in my nose. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's of all the smells that I've ever smelled, that like skunk really bothers me.
Well, it's very potent.
Yeah. And we happen to have a lot where I live. And so, oh my gosh. And I just thought of Amy because I was like, the smell won't get out of my nose.
I had people recommend stuff to me that was like a nasal spray that helped clear your sinuses. And they're like, just do this in the shower and it will help, because I know that like old school detectives, they'll put Vaseline and stuff. I'm like, why? You want that smell with you for a week? Like once that's up there, it's there. Like in your nose hairs, you better shave all your nose hairs too while you're at it. Like, no, thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, literally, I feel like it just brews in your sinuses and it's like, I'm going to be here for a while.
It's horrible.
It is. It is. So I know that before we've talked about, specifically, I know that me and you have talked about, you know, why you would not want to be cremated and what's the importance of basically burying someone in a nice casket. So that's because sometimes you have to exhume people. That's, you know, for me, it's a preference thing. So, and because of a couple of reasons. So one, like I said, in Houston, they can be affected by storms. I know that when I went to New Orleans, this was almost 5 years ago, and this was after Hurricane Katrina. And I asked one of our like Uber drivers to take me to the coolest cemetery because I wanted to see all the mausoleums and stuff. And he was telling us how a lot of these cemeteries were affected by the hurricane because it caused buried bodies and coffins to float and for things to move. I mean, it's already natural for the ground to shift, right? That's just like a natural occurrence. You can't stop that from happening. But then think about, then you have this hurricane, and then if someone isn't properly buried, and then now you have new dead bodies and all those things, it's like we have to re-identify this person and these other people, because I know, especially what's going on right now in North Carolina, they have to identify a lot of these people. So you better hope you get to them before a crocodile or something does.
So did they exhume these bodies?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they did. Okay. So
yeah, well, not in the 70s. They ended up doing it, you know, in like 2010 because of DNA.
Well, okay, but you also said something about like, I asked you in the episode, again, that won't air, about if it's important, like with the casket, and like, do you get an expensive one or is it worth it? Because, you know, sometimes I feel like it's just the hustle of the salesperson. No offense to anybody who sells caskets, but you know, that's what I feel like, oh, get the Cadillac of coffins. You're like, why? You know, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, it's different if you're putting like a Louis Vuitton fabric on the inside of it. That's really not going to make a difference. I know you might feel bougie in death, but hey, I don't think that's going to help. It's a lot of it is the type of wood that it is, the density of the wood and how it's treated, because you want something that's basically going to lock in or basically lock out anything that, of course, you know, you're going to have insects, you're going to have the soil, any moisture. So you want to be able to preserve that body well in those coffins, because basically whenever oxygen makes contact with something, it's going to break it down. So you don't want it affected by the elements either. So kind of like not like there's air conditioning, it's like a temperature control kind of thing, right? The more moisture that's in there, the more humid it's going to get, it's going to heat that up, etc. So you want to keep that person dry, because if you do have to exhume them, you want to be able to have a nice pristine body to look at.
Oh, I wonder if maybe we talked about this in part 2. I haven't listened to that episode because that was the Ed Gein, because I was asking about something else, which you guys will hear in that episode. But what if someone goes, oh, Amy, I don't think my body's going to need to be exhumed for any reason because there is no foul play. Would you ever need to dig up a body, maybe for DNA, to like link them to somebody else?
I don't think that necessarily. So now, because you have genealogy and you have family trees because of all these DNA testings, you're going to be able to find a link to someone in that family tree. Now, I wouldn't say, hey, like you can't be cremated because someday I might need to be identified. They would actually be able to identify me by basically my DNA that could be linked to like a cousin or something, and wouldn't have to necessarily be. It's a better chance of being linked to a sibling with someone who shares the same mitochondrial DNA from the mother. But hey, if you want to be cremated, Kelly, I'm not going to stop you because I don't plan on being murdered. Dying in a suspicious way.
I'm just wondering because, I wouldn't have thought of that, but I just didn't know if they're digging bodies up for any reason other than, they suspect foul play or like.
I mean, like this case, for example, not only just because of the foul play, but because of misidentification, that happened a lot. And DNA has really come a long way. Now you don't need like this large chunk of bone. You can do touch DNA or you can swab or something like that. Obviously, the more DNA, the better, because you don't want to have to keep exhuming a person. But in this instance, they weren't exhuming bodies for like a re-examination of cause of manner of death. They were doing that to basically correctly identify these people. I don't know if they just came up with new evidence at the time that made them say, hey, we think we messed up with this, or maybe they found out later on that this body that had been identified or misidentified, maybe he popped up somewhere else. And so anything that's going to cause that into question, especially with this many bodies, it's important for them to be able to have that. And they did keep track of where they were buried and what lots or spaces they were in. There was a couple that were mentioned here, but the one in particular with this individual, his name was Billy Jean Balk Jr. And they actually exhumed him it was in Houston, out of the Garden of Memory Cemetery. And so here it literally says in lot 171, block 2, space 8, buried on October 12th of 1973. And so they had to exhume him. And then they sent him over to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences. And that's in Houston, Texas as well. And here we have our doctor lawyer, Joseph. And then there's another doctor here that is Sharon Derrick. And so they're the ones that are going to be basically re-examining these bones. I think that there was a mixture of bones in there too. I think Billy was the victim, where it was him and his brother were both victims of the Candyman. So I think that at the time when they exhumed him, because we know when they were buried in the boathouse, because they were stacked on top of each other, I'm sure that some of those bones got mixed together. So I think that they were actually buried together in the same space. So they ended up exhuming the remains. This is February 10th of 2011. So the remains were exhumed from this cemetery. And so they did anthropological and DNA data. And so the remains had been submerged within a muddy casket. And so what happened was it waterlogged and softened the skeletal remains. And so it makes those, much more fragile. So there again, why it's important to have a nice casket. However, I will say if they're not sure who the body is and they're unidentified at the time and nobody claims them, I think the county has to bury them. I don't think it's the state. I believe it's the county, and it might be different places. So what my knowledge is from where I used to work is that the county would essentially bury them unless the body was donated to science to like a medical school for them to do, autopsies on or whatever, because that's how students learn. So we know that these bones were not in the best condition. Like I said, there was 2 skeletal remains combined, and then they ended up having to separate those. And so they examined them by stereo microscope. So I think I said before, you use a stereo microscope. They use this a lot for like tool mark impressions, specifically like projectiles. And so your stereo microscope works on larger items that are dense and cannot basically, you can only zoom in so far on them. The important thing is like the right amount of lighting. And then you can also photograph. Now there's really cool microscopes where you can just hook up the microscope to your computer and take pictures. But so they did that. And then they sent this, it says second set was submitted to UNT. So that's University of North Texas. I'm not sure if North Texas is one of the places where they have the body farm. There's two now. I know there's one in Tennessee and I think there is one in Texas. So maybe North Texas is where they have the body farm.
What's that?
You don't know what the body farm is? It's so cool. Well, to me it is. So basically the body farm or body farms now, bodies that are donated to science, they will basically put them out into different conditions to study the rate of decomposition. So they can, say, for example, put someone out in an open field and not covering them to basically see what the wildlife does to them, maybe how far a certain animal might drag a part of a body, how the insects will affect the decomposition rate, the weather. They track all of these things for decomposition. So the body farms, especially being in Tennessee, I'm sure you can imagine, very humid. It's basically the study of how bodies are going to break down after death. And actually I helped one of my friends when she was doing her thesis. She did something similar to this, but with pigs. And you put them in a basically controlled environment. So one you would have uncovered, and then you had a couple that were basically, they had cages over them, or maybe it was a certain body part, and she put trackers into certain bones. And so you could see what the wildlife was doing with these. So how far they could drag off certain bones and how long it would take, for example, for like insects to break down an entire body. So really interesting, actually, except for the smell. But you can learn a lot because sometimes when bodies are dumped out in certain areas, like say, for example, coyotes will drag like smaller limbs because skulls aren't necessarily like a big thing, but they'll take things back to their den for their cubs or for their pups. And so maybe someone finds one of these bones in a den, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's where that body was buried at. So you kind of are trying to figure out your range of your area where that body could be and expand it from there, and how far this certain species of animal in this area is known to basically feed on these types of things. So body farms in a condensed in my condensed version. So I'm sure I could have made that shorter. So we know there were 28 victims, right? And so these were just two of those. And basically, there's a couple different ways that they identified these people. So I'm looking at some different things here. They're saying like partially fleshed, recovered on 8/8 of 73 from dirt floor facility in Houston. And then there's disarticulated skeletal remains that were found in burial site of this certain county. Some of these bodies, because of these things or the circumstances that they were found in, and basically because of what Henley told them, they made this identification on these things. So they originally took in Michael Bach Jr., I think on October 9th of 73, and then released him to the funeral home the next day. And I'm like, that's insane, because I don't ever know of any case where we were able to get an unidentified person correctly identified within the day. Like, I would say a fast identification would be at least a week, because you're having to get all these different documentations, x-rays, whatever. Even if you have an ID on them with the dentures in their mouth, all those things, like I said, you're still having to track down all that information. And then your anthropologist has to confirm it. And then your pathologist has to confirm that. So it's like a day is insane. So they ended up being able to use all of these new things for an identification for Michael Bach Jr. They said there was 60% of his skeleton that was basically, because remember I said there was two mixed together. So what they did was they took a metatarsal and then they submitted that for DNA.
What's a metatarsal?
It's going to be one of your smaller bones, like fingers, toes kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
So a really small bone, which wouldn't necessarily be something that you would need for a full identification, I would say, if you're looking at like injuries and certain type of structures from, for example, we know that when people have certain surgeries done and they get x-rays of those bones, like I was saying earlier, like a hip joint, or maybe someone had a plate with screws put in, that would be something that would be a helpful thing for identification. So other things that were specifically identified to him, which is actually pretty interesting, like I talked about earlier when we were saying that healed fractures are different from new fractures because they have that kind of calcification over them. So they were saying that he did have this fracture on his, I believe it was his right arm or elbow. There was a couple different things that they looked at here. The first thing, they said the right side of his body was more robust than the left. Now, they're just looking at the specific bone, and it's an innominate, so it basically has no name. I don't think they could properly identify exactly what it was, but they said that it was more robust, so bigger on that side than the other side. Then they looked at the surface of the pelvis. So the pelvis can actually tell you a lot of things. Obviously, the sex, the gender. For women, if that person has ever given birth, you can definitely tell if it's more developed for a female body than it is for male, because we know that males are more narrow hipped. And so they did say that the femurs fit and articulated well into this pelvis as they should with the bones that were found with him. And then they did actually use part of that femur through DNA. So they were able to identify that back to Billy. They then looked at the vertebrae, so the spine here. So they looked at one in particular, the thoracic vertebrae. So one in the middle, and then they used one from the lumbar. So that's like your lower part of your back. Your thoracic is kind of the middle part of your back. And they showed that some were more developed and could represent an older individual. And a lot of times what your spine can tell you is basically what kind of load someone was carrying on their body. So you can tell if someone's had a disc that has degenerated because it would be like bone on bone, or some discs will create little indentions into the spongy part of that bone. And so basically, you can tell, different types of injuries if someone's been in an accident. So they were saying that some of his vertebrae looked like there could be some differentiation in age due to this type of herniation, indentation. A lot of times that's caused in an older age, unless someone has some type of like degenerative disc disease or like an autoimmune disease. And so that can weaken the vertebral discs and cause like that degeneration. Then they looked at some of the ribs. There they said again that the one side is more robust than the other side. And maybe that was because he is more dominant on one side than the other. So there again, what the body kind of carries as far as load and their weight. We know that at the time that he was abducted, he was 17 years old and was approximately 5'9". So when they actually went through the whole bone structure that was found, so 60% of his bones, they were able to narrow this down and put him within the age of 16 to 19. They said that his ancestry would be white with some possible Native American mix, that it would be a male, and his stature somewhere between 5'3" and 5'9". There again, it'd be more helpful if they had the entire skeleton to work with. Some things that they used, that anthropologists use, there's a couple different methods that they look at. So I know we specifically talked about like the pelvis before. This is like the Suchi Brooks method. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. So this is like the most widely accepted method. So it's actually used to estimate the age of the pubic symphysis. And so that's going to be that little tiny like joint or like disc that's like in between the bottom part of your pelvis. So it can actually tell a lot from the pubic symphysis. Basically, like I said, how much weight bearing was put on your hips, because your pelvis will absorb a lot of that weight and like kind of uses like a shock absorber. So then you have that cartilage that is in that joint, like I had said before, and you can see how worn down that is as well. If there's shearing and tension, if someone did have, maybe you could say an injury on one side, that would cause their hips to shift and cause more pressure on that pelvis. So they use some other things for like sex determination. The Eischen model, I believe that this was done off a study in Mexico based upon just boys. And so they said that this will reflect a certain age range between your sternal end and your fourth rib, which before you asked me what your sternum is.
Oh, yeah. And well, I asked you what the fourth rib was.
So yeah. So of course your sternum is in the middle of your chest and it connects some of your ribs there. And then the fourth rib would be basically what's attached there. And they're looking at basically how much wear there would be or growth on that fourth rib. So they will look at, like I said, histology. There again, you can cut these bones down to very thin pieces and look at them under the microscope. And you're going to be looking at the bone density. For compact bones, that's going to be like your long bones. Those are going to be a little more dense than, say, like the femoral head or like the joint. So that's going to look a little more spongy under a microscope. And so without giving all these crazy names that are hard to pronounce, because I'm not an anthropologist, they're able to actually determine through all these different methods that he did show that it was between 17 to 19 years old. And one even says specifically 18 and a half years old. So we've talked about dentition. So the third molar, that's actually something that they look at for a specific age range. So if your wisdom teeth are growing in, that's a good indicator of what age you're going to be in. Now, there's some people that will develop those later in life, but they said that this mean age should sit this skeleton at about 16.4 years old. They also took some different cranial measurements, which should basically confirm the race of this person. And so the Gill and Rhine model, it's interesting because they actually look at the nasal profile. So basically like the tip of your, like the spine and your nasal depression, they look at that like nasal, if there's an overgrowth or like basically if there's any type of breakage there or anything that would be like an undergrowth. So you could tell like the size of the nose. And so that's the Gill and Rhine. Then we have one that we've actually talked about before with our Idaho murder cases is basically the structure of the skull, where you can talk about like the pronouncement of the eyebrow. And so they look at like 5 different things. So they're looking at like they do measurements. So of the
Frankenstein brain or the Frankenstein brain, Frankenstein brow.
Yeah. So they look at 5 different zones of the cranium. So they're taking different measurements there. And like they said, if there's anything that seems very pronounced, that would be a good identification. So like the nose, the eyebrows, the chin. And then, of course, this is all done through antemortem x-rays. So antemortem is pre-death, and then they compare those to your postmortem x-rays. So like I said, one big thing that we know from Billy is that he had broken his left elbow in 1966. So it was 5 years prior to his death or his estimated time of death. So this should have left a well-healed fracture. And so they said that they were actually able to observe that on what they call the distal left radius. So that radius is, one of your longer bones that runs along like your forearm. And the injury occurred or appeared to be healed within that time frame of when his family said that. So it was 11 years old at the time that he had broken his elbow. And so they said that 5 years time would be the approximate healed fracture time. So they did look at other things like hair color that was still present at the time. They looked, I think I told you, like pronounced canines. I'm like, does he have vampire teeth? I mean, that's not necessarily a good indication of that's who that person is. But they were able to actually get DNA samples from the siblings. So I think there was 4 siblings total out of their family. And they were able, I think specifically, they got the DNA from the sister, and they did nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondrial is always great because you can directly show that lineage to the mother. And then they said that from this DNA sample that it was 820 million times more likely to be related to his sister than not. So if you think of how many people are in the world and within this specific region, I would say that those are pretty good odds. Yeah. So wrapped up in a little nutshell for everybody, there's a lot that goes into anthropology and making post-mortem identifications. I will say it is much better than what it used to be. But so Billy was finally able to be correctly identified in 2010. So I hope that brought their family some form of not just comfort, but maybe closure, or maybe able to turn the chapter, right? So that's what I got for this guy here. What's funny is actually Henley was the reason why the Candyman died. He was the murderer of him. We know that Henley actually brought a couple of friends back to the residence. One was a female and there was a male. And the Candyman wasn't very happy about that. So he was going to torture them and then said, as punishment to you, you also have to partake in this. And Henley was not cool with that. So he ended up using the Candyman's own gun and shooting him. So, and then that's when he like gave himself up too. So I think most of these, they said that they strangled these people. Only one of them was shot, but that would be really hard to tell once the bodies are very badly decomposed. So other than them finding, like the blinds, curtain blinds,
with
rope.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. Terrible human beings.
Oh, well, just wait till part 2.
It only gets better. Yeah.
Well, Amy and I are excited. We're getting ready for our crime cruise, which is in a couple of weeks. So if you guys have any questions for us, or if you're going to be going or attending crime cruise, let us know. You can email us at kelly@diaryofadethinvestigator.com.
And we'll look you up before we go.
Or message us on our Instagram page, Diary of a Death Investigator. Apologies for the tech issue, and that's why this is coming out late. Amy and I really did
I feel like I made up for that because I ordered stickers for people. So those should be in soon. You can get your very own Diary of a Death Investigator sticker.
Yeah. You can message us on our Instagram page and we'll send you one.
Or hopefully our Patreon soon.
Yeah, we're working on that too. We're working on a lot of things. Mostly I'm just working. So
working on working.
Working on working. I'd like
the grind.
For real. It's real. The struggle is real. But until next time,
bye.